Welcome to the Deep Stories channel, where we tell stories that touch the heart and reveal the complexities of human life. Today, you will learn the story of Emily Thompson, a woman who, in the face of adversity, discovered the true nature of those around her. It's a story of betrayal and greed, but also of justice and redemption. Get ready for an emotional journey that will make you reflect on the true value of love and loyalty. Emily Thompson was a 45-year-old woman known for her kindness and the way she always put others before herself. Her life seemed to be what many would consider ideal. A marriage of more than 2 decades with Michael, a man with whom she shared joys and sorrows, a cozy home on the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts, and a successful career as a nurse at a local hospital. Emily always believed that, no matter the difficulties, her family would remain united. Autumn in Boston brought with it a melancholic beauty. The orange and red leaves fell from the trees, creating a natural carpet on the city streets. Emily loved this time of year. To her, autumn symbolized renewal, a time to leave the past behind and embrace what the future held. However, this autumn would be different. Very different. It all started with a persistent cough. Emily, who had always been very careful with her health, didn't think much of it at first. Probably just allergies or the dry autumn air, she thought to herself. But when the cough intensified and the constant exhaustion became impossible to ignore, Emily decided to see her doctor. It was a decision made more out of precaution than real concern. Dr. James Carter's office was a familiar place for Emily. They had known each other for years, ever since Emily began working at the hospital. Dr. Carter was a serious man, but with a generous heart. He knew that Emily wasn't the type to complain easily, so when she sought him out, he immediately knew something was wrong. "Emily, I'm going to examine you and run some tests. It could just be a bad cold, but it's better to be sure," said Dr. Carter in a reassuring tone. Emily nodded, trying to push away any negative thoughts. She underwent the tests calmly, trusting that the results would bring good news. The following days were filled with anxiety. Michael noticed Emily's concern, but life for him continued as usual. He was busy with his job as a financial consultant, dealing with clients who demanded his attention. "I'm sure everything will be fine, Em," he would say whenever she mentioned the tests. "You're strong. Don't worry." Emily appreciated Michael's words, but there was a growing unease in her heart. She had always been intuitive, and something inside her whispered that the results might not be what she expected. When the phone finally rang, with Dr. Carter on the other end of the line, Emily knew her life was about to change forever. "Emily, I'd like you to come to the office as soon as possible. We need to discuss the results," said Dr. Carter with a seriousness she had never heard before. The journey to the office seemed longer than ever. The autumn colors, which always brought comfort to Emily, now felt oppressive. Each step she took toward Dr. Carter's office was accompanied by a growing sense of dread. When she finally entered the office, Dr. Carter greeted her with a look that confirmed her worst fears. He led her to his office, closing the door behind them. "Emily, I'm so sorry," he began, his voice heavy with the responsibility of delivering such devastating news. "The test showed something we didn't expect. You have a tumor in your lungs, and unfortunately, it's in a very advanced stage." The words echoed in Emily's mind like a death sentence. She felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. Dr. Carter continued to explain the details, talking about palliative care options and what they could do to ensure she had the maximum comfort possible in the remaining months. But Emily could barely hear him. All she could think about was how this would affect Michael, how it would affect the life they had built together. After a few minutes, Dr. Carter paused. "I know this is a lot to process, Emily. You have every right to feel this way. But I want you to know that we're here for you every step of the way." Emily thanked him with a silent nod, trying to keep her composure. After a few minutes, she left the office with the test papers in her hands, but with her mind in turmoil. The journey home was a fog of confused thoughts. She knew she needed to tell Michael, but how? How could she look him in the eyes and say that the future they had planned together was falling apart? When she finally arrived home, the house felt different. The place that had always been a refuge now seemed empty and cold. Michael was sitting on the couch, reading a report, unaware of the storm that was about to break over them. Emily paused for a moment, watching him, trying to capture that moment in her memory before everything changed. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He looked up, noticing the gravity in Emily's expression. "What's wrong, Em? You're scaring me." Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. I went to the doctor today. The results of my test came back." Michael put the report aside, his attention now fully focused on her. "What did they say?" "Everything okay?" he asked, anxiety rising in his voice. Emily felt the tears start to form, but she fought to keep control. "Michael, I have cancer, and it's in an advanced stage. They said there's not much they can do." The silence that followed was deafening. Michael seemed frozen, unable to process the words. Emily waited for some kind of reaction, a word of comfort, a gesture of support, but all he did was stand there, looking at her as if the world around him had stopped. Finally, he got up, walked over to her, and held her hands. "We'll get through this, Em," he said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that Emily had never heard before. He hugged her, but the warmth she expected wasn't there. Something had changed, something she couldn't fully understand, but she could feel deeply. In the days that followed, Emily tried to maintain normalcy. She continued going to work, although her energy was waning. But the illness wasn't the only thing that was changing. Michael was more distant, colder. He spent more time at work, and when he was home, he always seemed to have his mind elsewhere. Emily's concern turned into a silent certainty. Cancer wasn't just destroying her body, but also her marriage. As the days passed, Emily began to realize that something was terribly wrong, not just with her body, but also with her marriage. Michael, who had always been her pillar of strength, was distancing himself more and more. He would come home late, avoid deep conversations, and when he was present, he seemed to be in another world. For Emily, Michael's behavior was an even more painful blow than the illness itself. She knew that cancer was destroying her body, but what she didn't expect was that it would also start to destroy her relationship. Despite everything, Emily tried to convince herself that it was just stress. Michael had always been a practical man, someone who dealt with difficult emotions in his own way. She imagined that he needed time to process the situation. However, as weeks turned into months, the distance between them only grew. Emily began to feel isolated, as if she were facing this battle completely alone. It was during this period of uncertainty and pain that Emily began to notice the more frequent presence of Karen, her mother-in-law. Karen had always been an imposing figure in their lives, a woman who, though polite and cordial, carried with her an air of superiority. Emily had always known that Karen never fully accepted her as a daughter-in-law. There was something in their relationship that had always been superficial, but until then, Emily believed it was just Karen's way. Now, however, she began to realize that her mother-in-law's presence was tied to something more than simple concern. Karen started visiting Emily's home frequently, often without warning. She would come with her kind words, but there was always an underlying coldness in her tone. Gradually, Karen began to ask increasingly intrusive questions. At first, they were subtle, questions about Emily's health status, but they quickly evolved into questions about finances and the future. "Emily, have you thought about how Michael will manage after?" "Well, you know," Karen would say, her voice laden with false concern. Despite her growing weakness, Emily began to realize what was happening. Karen was less interested in her well-being and more concerned with what would happen to the family's finances after her death. This realization brought a deep sadness to Emily, who was already struggling against physical and emotional pain. But what she discovered next was even more devastating. Michael and Karen had always believed that Emily would inherit a large fortune from a distant uncle, a wealthy man who had passed away a few years earlier. Emily never cared about money. For her, the most important thing had always been love and family. However, Michael and Karen had different expectations. They always believed that this inheritance would be a financial safety net for the family. The expectation of receiving this fortune had, for many years, been one of the reasons that kept Karen close to Emily, despite their differences. One night, while Emily was lying in bed, listening to Michael's breathing beside her, she overheard a conversation between him and Karen in the next room. They thought she was asleep, but the pain-induced insomnia kept her awake. The words she heard were like knives to her heart. "I don't understand, Mom. Are you sure there's nothing? No money, no property that she might be hiding from us?" Michael's voice was filled with frustration. "I've already checked, Michael. I spoke with her lawyer, looked through all the documents. There's nothing. Not even that damned uncle left anything significant. All this time, I thought she was hiding something from us, but no, she has nothing. We're wasting our time." Karen's voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. Emily felt her heart tighten. Silent tears streamed down her face as she listened to the conversation. The pain she felt in her chest was much more than physical. It was the pain of knowing that those who were supposed to love and support her were more concerned about the money they might or might not receive after her death. The support she thought she had was, in fact, a farce, fueled by greed and the expectation of an inheritance that never existed. That night, as Michael finally fell asleep beside her, Emily stayed awake, staring at the dark ceiling. Her thoughts were in turmoil. How had she reached this point? How could the man with whom she had shared so many years of her life, with whom she had built a family, be so cruel? And Karen, her mother-in-law, who had always had such a strong presence in their lives, was now a dark figure, motivated only by greed. In the following days, Emily became even more introspective. She knew she couldn't continue pretending that everything was fine. The truth was clearer than ever. Michael and Karen were ready to abandon her now that they knew they wouldn't receive the inheritance they expected. But what they didn't know was that Emily had something much more valuable than money. Determined not to let Michael and Karen's greed dictate her final days, Emily began to make plans. She sought out her longtime friend and lawyer, Alice Reynolds, and together they reviewed Emily's will. She wanted to ensure that her legacy would go to those who truly loved her, those who were by her side not for money, but for love and friendship. Dr. James Carter, the doctor who had become a close friend, and Alice, who had always stood by her side, would be the beneficiaries. Additionally, Emily decided to donate part of her assets to charities, ensuring that her departure would have a positive impact, even as her own life was coming to an end. Meanwhile, Michael and Karen continued in their bubble of greed, oblivious to the plans Emily was making. They still believed they could find some hidden money, some way to profit from the situation, but Emily knew the truth, and she was ready to ensure that they received exactly what they deserved. Emily's days became a mixture of physical and emotional pain. She was aware that time was running out, but what hurt her the most wasn't the approaching death, but the imminent abandonment by the people she thought were her family. The cancer was slowly consuming her body, but what truly corroded her soul was the coldness that now permeated her home. Emily knew that Michael and Karen were no longer by her side out of love or compassion, but because of a frustrated expectation of profit. And that was a blow that not even the worst of diseases could inflict. One morning, Emily woke up with an emptiness in her chest, a kind of foreboding that she couldn't shake off. Michael was more distant than ever, spending less and less time at home. When he was there, he avoided any kind of emotional contact, limiting their conversations to trivialities. Emily noticed this, but exhausted, she simply didn't have the strength to confront him. Their relationship, which had once been based on love and partnership, now had dwindled down to a painful silence. On that specific morning, Michael entered the bedroom where Emily was lying down, his expression more serious than usual. He stood at the door for a moment, as if trying to find the right words to say. Emily, sensing the tension in the air, sat up in bed, feeling the weight of expectation. "Michael, what is it?" she asked, her voice weak but still trying to sound concerned. Michael let out a long sigh before finally speaking. "Emily, I think we need to talk about what's going to happen from now on," he said, his voice cold, without the warmth she so longed for. "You know I care about you, but I don't know how else to say this. I can't handle this situation anymore." The words fell on Emily like a cold shower. "What are you talking about, Michael?" she asked, already dreading the answer. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze, and that only increased Emily's anxiety. I need some time," he continued. "This is all too much for me. I think we need to separate. I'm going to move into the apartment that my mother has in the city. You know, to clear my head and think about the future. Emily felt as if the ground was opening up beneath her feet. She knew their relationship was in ruins, but hearing those words at that moment was a devastating blow. Separate? Michael, I'm dying. Emily's voice finally failed, her pain turning into a desperate cry. You're going to leave me now, when I need you the most? Michael finally looked her in the eyes, but what Emily saw there was indifference. Emily, I'm not able to handle this. I tried, but I can't. I need space. I need to think about my future. I'm sorry, but I can't stay here anymore. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. Michael's words were like knives in her heart, but the expression on his face, the lack of any empathy, was even worse. And what about our marriage? And the vows we made? She whispered, almost inaudibly, as if she were still trying to find a trace of the man she married. I don't know anymore, Emily. Maybe we never really thought about what those vows meant. I'm going to pack my things, Michael said, leaving the room before Emily could respond. The silence left behind was deafening. Emily remained sitting on the bed, in a state of shock, unable to believe that her husband, the man who had promised to be by her side in sickness and in health, was really leaving. As Michael packed his bags in the next room, Emily felt overwhelmed by a deep sadness, but also by a clarity she hadn't felt before. She realized that the man with whom she had shared her life for more than 20 years was more concerned with his own future than with hers. He was fleeing, unable to deal with the reality of her illness. And for Michael, love seemed to have a limit defined by the absence of material benefits. When Michael walked out the door, without looking back, Emily knew he wouldn't return. He wouldn't be by her side in her final moments, wouldn't hold her hand when the pain became unbearable. Michael had made his choice, and that choice said more about him than any words could express. In the days that followed, Karen's presence became almost unbearable. She appeared at Emily's house, ostensibly to help with the things Michael had left behind, but her true purpose was as clear as day. Karen was there to make sure nothing of value was left, that Emily wasn't hiding any assets or investments that could be claimed after her death. Every time Karen opened a closet or drawer, Emily felt a sharp pain, a pain that went beyond the cancer that was consuming her. One day, Karen entered Emily's room without knocking, carrying a packet of documents. Emily, dear, we need to organize your things. You know, for when the time comes. Michael and I want to make sure everything is in order, she said, with a tone that mixed false concern with impatience. Emily, exhausted and emotionally drained, finally reached her limit. Karen, please leave, she said, her voice firm despite her weakness. Karen paused, surprised by the firmness in Emily's voice. I know why you're here. I know what you and Michael really want. But let me make one thing clear. There's nothing here for you. No money, no properties, nothing. Now please, leave me in peace. Karen hesitated for a moment, but the coldness in her eyes was evident. She quickly composed herself, her face returning to that expression of false cordiality. As you wish, Emily, she said with a forced smile before leaving the room. Emily watched her go, knowing that this would probably be the last time she would see her mother-in-law. She felt relieved, but also deeply sad. The cancer was destroying her body, but greed and lack of humanity were destroying what was left of her family. In the following days, Emily focused on organizing the things that really mattered. She made one last visit to Alice Reynolds, her lawyer, to ensure that her will was in order. The instructions were clear. Michael and Karen would receive absolutely nothing. All her legacy would go to the people who truly loved her and cared for her. Emily felt that, at least in this aspect, she was regaining some control over her life. As she prepared for the inevitable, Emily no longer felt alone, despite being physically by herself. She knew she had done the right thing, and that brought her a peace that neither Michael nor Karen would ever understand. And so, with dignity and strength, Emily prepared for the next chapter of her journey, knowing that when the time came, she would be ready. Emily knew that time was running out. Her physical strength was diminishing every day, but her determination to leave behind a legacy that reflected who she truly was only grew stronger. After Michael and Karen abandoned her, Emily realized she needed to ensure that her final act would be a reflection of her true essence, of who she was, not who circumstances had forced her to become. Her first visit after Michael left was to the office of Alice Reynolds, her longtime friend and lawyer. Alice had been one of the few people who stayed by Emily's side throughout the process, offering not only legal support but also a friendly shoulder to lean on. Alice was a strong woman, with unwavering ethics and a compassionate heart, who understood the importance of what Emily was about to do. Alice's office was located in a historic building in downtown Boston, with large windows that let in the soft afternoon light. Emily had always liked the cozy and organized space, which reflected Alice's meticulous personality. When Emily entered, Alice greeted her with a warm smile, but also with an expression of concern that she couldn't hide. "Emily, dear, how are you feeling?" Alice asked, standing up to greet her. Her voice carried a gentleness that Emily hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm as well as I can be," Emily replied, trying to smile, but without much conviction. She sat down in the comfortable chair in front of Alice's desk, feeling the weight of exhaustion on her shoulders. "I wanted to talk about the will. I think we need to make some changes." Alice nodded, already anticipating what Emily wanted. "Of course, Emily. I'm here to help with whatever you need. What do you have in mind?" Emily took a deep breath, organizing her thoughts. She knew this was one of the most important decisions she would make and wanted to ensure that everything was done correctly. "Alice, I want to make sure that Michael and Karen don't get anything," she said with a determination that even surprised herself. "They abandoned me when I needed them the most. They don't deserve anything that I worked my whole life to build." Alice looked at Emily with understanding. She knew the pain her friend was going through and understood the motivation behind this decision. "I understand, Emily, and you're right to want to protect what's yours. We can draft the will so that your assets go to other people or causes that you truly care about. Have you thought about who you'd like to benefit?" Emily had reflected on this during many lonely nights. "Yes," she replied, in a softer tone of voice. "I want Dr. James Carter to receive a part. He has been more than a doctor. He has been a true friend. Also, I want to leave something for you, Alice. You were by my side when no one else was." Alice was visibly moved by Emily's words. "Emily, I don't know what to say. I'm honored, but what matters to me is that you are at peace with your decisions." "I am, Alice," said Emily with a sincere smile. "And I also want part of my assets to go to charities, especially those that support cancer patients and their families. I want my experience, in some way, to help others not feel as alone as I did." Alice picked up a pen and began to jot down Emily's instructions. "That's very noble of you, Emily. I'll make sure everything is done according to your wishes." As Alice wrote, Emily felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt that she was regaining control of her life, or at least what was left of it. This sense of power, even if momentary, brought her unexpected peace. She couldn't change the fact that she was dying, but she could decide how she would leave, and that was something no one could take from her. The days that followed were a mixture of preparation and reflection. Emily began to organize her belongings, separating what was important to her from what could be donated or discarded. Each item she handled carried with it a memory, some sweet, others bitter. But Emily found comfort in putting everything in order, knowing she was closing the chapter of her life in the way she desired. Meanwhile, Michael and Karen continued with their lives, seemingly oblivious to what was happening with Emily. They believed that by distancing themselves from her, they were freeing themselves from an unbearable burden. However, what they didn't know was that Emily was preparing one final surprise, something that would reveal the true nature of their actions. One afternoon, Emily decided to visit the hospital one last time. She wanted to personally thank Dr. James Carter for everything he had done for her. When she arrived at the hospital, she was greeted with hugs and kind words from her former colleagues, who knew the gravity of her situation but respected her strength and courage. Dr. Carter was in his office when Emily entered. He stood up immediately, surprised but happy to see her. "Emily, what a nice surprise. How are you?" he asked, pulling up a chair for her. Emily smiled, trying to hide the exhaustion she felt. "I'm fine, James. I wanted to come here to thank you for everything. You've been a great support to me, and I'll never forget that." Dr. Carter held Emily's hand firmly, his eyes showing the compassion she so valued. "Emily, you don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job, but knowing that I could help in some way means a lot to me." Emily nodded, touched. "You did more than your job, James. You gave me hope and treated me like a friend, not just a patient. That's priceless." They talked for a while, reminiscing about moments and sharing confidences. For Emily, this visit was like a farewell, a goodbye that, although painful, was necessary. When she finally got up to leave, Dr. Carter accompanied her to the door with a sad but genuine smile. As she walked back home, Emily felt a mixture of emotions. She knew the end was near, but she also knew that she was leaving everything in order. There was a sense of peace in her heart, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Her life hadn't been perfect, and her end certainly wouldn't be easy, but Emily was determined to leave with dignity. When she arrived home, Emily sat in her favorite armchair, looking out the window. The autumn leaves were falling softly, as if the world were in perfect harmony with her state of mind. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of tranquility, knowing that soon everything would be complete. Emily Thompson's death came on a cold winter morning, shortly after her last visit to the hospital. There was no agony, just a quiet end, as if her soul had decided it was time to go. Those who had stayed by her side until the end, nurses, friends from the hospital, and the ever-faithful Alice Reynolds, felt a mixture of sadness and relief. They were sad because they had lost a dear friend, but relieved because Emily's suffering had finally ended. The news of Emily's death reached Michael and Karen in an impersonal way, through a call from the hospital. They received the news with controlled expressions, but deep in their hearts, there was a sense of relief mixed with an anxiety they couldn't fully explain. They knew the will would be read soon, and the anticipation of finally discovering what, if anything, Emily had left for them hung in the air. The funeral was scheduled for a week after her death, in a small chapel on the outskirts of Boston. The chosen location was simple but welcoming, reflecting Emily's modest personality. Alice took care of all the arrangements, ensuring that everything was exactly as Emily had wished. She knew that even after death, Emily wanted her legacy to be one of peace and dignity. On the day of the funeral, snow fell gently, covering the city with a white, silent blanket. Friends and colleagues from Emily's work began to arrive early, each bringing with them memories and stories of the kind woman who had touched their lives. Dr. James Carter was among the first to arrive, his expression reflecting the sadness of losing someone he deeply respected and cared for. He greeted the others with a silent nod before sitting in the front row, near the casket. Michael and Karen arrived together, with expressions that mixed solemnity and anxiety. Michael wore a flawless black suit, while Karen was dressed in a formal gown and a heavy wool coat. Both maintained a straight posture, but those who knew them could see the tension on their faces. They entered the chapel and were immediately greeted by Alice, who observed them with sharp eyes. "Michael, Karen, thank you for coming," said Alice, in a polite but distant tone. She knew what was about to happen and was prepared to face the situation. "Of course, Alice," Michael replied, in a voice that tried to sound genuine but failed to hide the underlying coldness. "We wanted to be here to say goodbye to Emily." Karen, for her part, remained silent, surveying the environment as if searching for something that wasn't there. The thought that there might be nothing for them, after all they had gone through, was a fear she couldn't shake off. The ceremony began shortly after Michael and Karen arrived. The pastor, an elderly man with a soft and compassionate voice, conducted the service with dignity and respect, speaking about Emily's life, her qualities, and the impact she had on those who knew her. There were moments of silence for reflection, and many of the attendees struggled to hold back tears as they remembered the woman who had left too soon. When the service ended, Alice stood up and walked to the front of the chapel, holding a sealed envelope. She took a deep breath before speaking, knowing that what she was about to do would change the atmosphere of the place. "Emily asked me to share a message with you today," Alice began, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "She wrote this letter shortly before she passed and asked me to read it after the ceremony." A soft murmur of surprise ran through the chapel as Alice opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. She took one last look around the room, catching the curious and anxious glances, especially from Michael and Karen, who now sat with expressions of contained expectation. "Dear friends and family," Alice began, reading Emily's words, "if you are hearing this, it means that I am no longer among you. I want to thank everyone who is here today, especially those who stood by me in my final days. The support and love I received mean more to me than any words can express." Alice paused, feeling the emotion rise in her throat, but she knew she had to continue. "Unfortunately, not everyone who should have been by my side proved worthy of my trust or affection. Life taught me some harsh lessons in my final days, and it is with a heavy heart that I write the following words." At this point, the atmosphere in the chapel became tense. Michael and Karen exchanged quick glances, beginning to realize that something unexpected was about to be revealed. "Michael, you were my husband for more than 2 decades. We shared many moments together, both good and bad. But when I needed you most, you withdrew. It was a blow that hurt me more than any physical pain that cancer could cause. I cannot forgive your betrayal, and that's why I have decided that you will receive nothing from my will." The words echoed through the chapel, and a murmur of shock rippled through the attendees. Michael turned pale, his expression of disbelief quickly turning into restrained anger. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips as Alice continued reading. "Karen, you were like a mother to me in many moments, but when the truth came out, your love proved false. Your greed hurt me deeply, and that's why I have also decided that you will receive nothing. All of my legacy, modest as it may be, will go to the people who truly supported and loved me until the end." Alice paused again, giving time for Emily's words to sink into everyone's minds. The silence in the chapel was oppressive. Every breath seemed heavy with the weight of the revelation. "To my friends who stood by me, like Dr. James Carter and Alice Reynolds, I want you to know that my gratitude is immense. You are the true heirs of my legacy, not in money, but in love and memories. I have also designated part of my assets to charities that help cancer patients and their families. I hope that, in some way, my contribution can ease the pain of others, just as you eased mine." Alice finished reading with tears in her eyes, but with a sense of duty fulfilled. She looked at Michael and Karen, who now sat in shock, processing what they had just heard. The truth had been revealed, and they, who had hoped to profit from Emily's death, were left empty-handed and with heavy hearts. If this story touched your heart and you'd like to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Your participation is crucial for us to keep bringing emotional and impactful stories like this one. Let's spread messages that truly matter. Now, let's return to the conclusion of this poignant story. The other attendees began to rise slowly, offering words of comfort to Alice and Dr. Carter, while Michael and Karen remained seated, unable to move. For them, Emily's funeral wasn't just the end of her life, but also the end of their own illusions. Emily had passed, but she left behind a lesson that would resonate for a long time. The true value of life isn't in material wealth, but in human connections, in the love and compassion we offer to others. Michael and Karen learned this the hard way, and now, all that remained for them was to deal with the consequences of their choices. Emily Thompson's story reminds us that the true value of a person isn't in their material wealth, but in the love, loyalty, and compassion they offer to the world. Michael and Karen discovered, too late, that money cannot buy respect or true love. In her final days, Emily found the strength to ensure that her legacy was one of kindness, not bitterness. May this story make us reflect on our priorities in life and what truly matters when everything else falls away. Emily had passed, but she left behind a lesson that would resonate for a long time. The true value of life isn't in material wealth, but in human connections, in the love and compassion we offer to others. Michael and Karen learned this the hard way, and now, all that remained for them was to deal with the consequences of their choices. If this story touched you and made you reflect, leave a like and share it with those you think need to hear this message. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us by clicking on the subscribe button. Here on the Deep Stories channel, we continue to bring stories that move us and make us see what truly matters. Until the next story,